I joined Plaid in 2016. I actually used to work at a bank. I was at Capital One before this. I spent about 4 years working with financial institutions, primarily within our data access team. And then around September of last year, I switched over to our policy team. And so I'm currently working with our policy team on global open finance efforts, which is really around what happens next. I think we titled this section, Are We There Yet? And
are we?
In some, not quite, but we're making good progress. And I think 2020 has been a really interesting year for that, and we can totally get into it. But in the US, Plaid, we're working with banks, credit unions, neobanks, tech providers, and really there's a lot of energy and activity around open banking and open finance, and people, consumers, small businesses, people who have data being able to opt in to share it to get a better product and service. And really that's what it all comes down to, is consumers being able to opt in, transparently share their data, and being able to do it in a secure way. So Plaid, we're live in the US, Canada, the UK, and the European Union, but there's a whole host of other places that we'd like to go. So the rest of the world. And then also, what about other types of data? So in some countries, you only have certain types of data that are made available by regulation. In other countries, it's a little broader. And so we're really looking towards the future and saying, not just what use cases power a Robinhood or a Square Cash or a Venmo or a TransferWise or a You Need a Budget or any of these apps that are kind of built on top of Plaid today. But what is going to be needed in the future? What can we imagine as the seamless way I can be in control of my data as an individual, know where it's shared, and it's never difficult to share it. So that's the piece where we're not 100% there yet.
I get that. And I guess the question or the premise you've been asking, are we there yet? I know it's kind of a trick question because it almost sounds like from your answer, we'll never actually fully be anywhere as this is evolving over time. I mean, do you see it that way, or is there a point where
No, I don't see it that way. Actually, this is one of those Jeff Bezos, imagine the world in 10 years. And I can't imagine a world where it's harder for consumers. It's going to be much closer to snapping your finger, being able to be confident that the data is being shared securely, knowing that it's going from point A to point B. And you're going to be able to do that for all types of data. And so when I sometimes think of where does open finance fit into where the world is going? Well, there's open banking, which is almost a little more narrow than open finance because it doesn't include things like payroll data, right? I can't easily share my payroll data today. And I know a couple of companies that have spun up that are speaking at this conference that are focused entirely on that. Plaid, we're also super interested in that space. But then there's other data sets. My utilities data is not always being used. Beyond that, what about a broader consumer data right? There's countries like Australia that have actually said this and enshrined it in law that consumers own their data. And what does that mean? It's really straightforward. Consumers own their data. So that's not just going to be banking data. In the future, it's going to be your social media data. It's going to be all of the metadata that's kind of floating around out there right now. And for the most part, it's hard for consumers to get benefit, but it shouldn't be because we did it in the offline world, and it was much more complicated in the offline world because, if I wanted to get a mortgage from a competitor, I had to take my, red Wells Fargo statement into a blue Chase branch and actually show it to them. And they had to go make a photocopy in the back. And then at some points they were probably sending that overseas. People were checking boxes to see if all the information was there. With the computer, this should be a pretty seamless process. And we do see that starting to happen. And a lot of it's happening because of cooperation between financial institutions and folks like Plaid, but other players in the industry, as well as non-governmental entities, and then also governments starting to step in and say, this is important and we should write regulation, we should write rules on this topic.
Interesting. So given that backdrop, Dan, and the evolution that you've described and looked out into the future, I mean, have you seen the definition of open finance sort of evolve over time as well?
I think open finance is actually newer, right? For the past 5 years, we've mostly been talking about open banking. And, Don Cardinal from FTX always jokes that there's open banking, big O, big B, and open banking, little o, little b. And, the open banking that's happening in the UK is a specific thing to the UK market. And I think that's one of the reasons we kind of prefer to use the term open finance now, because if you look at what they've done in the United Kingdom, it's great, right? They're mandating first that the 9 largest institutions, but eventually all financial institutions have to make data available for consumers. It's going to make the market more competitive over time, but right now it only covers payment accounts, which means, if you have investment data that you want to share in order to potentially like move all of your, assets over and get a better rate from like a financial advisor, you can't easily do that in a digital way, at least not via the mandated APIs.
Got it. So let's switch gears from the definition, I guess, to the ecosystem. Why is it important to have an open finance strategy?
Yeah, so there's 2 sides to this. One is sort of the neobanks and the fintechs and the folks who are coming up. And I think, if we roll back the clock 5 or 10 years, a lot of the banks were kind of like, this fintech stuff, it's nice, but it's really just a pretty front end. And, we won't have as pretty a front end today, but we can eventually catch up on that front. I think what's kind of interesting is to start to see some of these fintechs really build valuable tech that addresses use cases and needs. And so we see folks that are building across the ecosystem that actually like are really stepping in to provide critical functionality, whether that's, in payroll, helping people get access to their checks from like stimulus from the government. And people think it's a small thing, but like 3 or 4 days earlier is actually mission critical for a lot of Americans who are struggling to make it day to day. And 2020 was a really hard year. If you lost your job and you were out of work, you needed that stimulus check, and 3 days mattered. We see it in the small business space where a lot of the fintechs have been leading the way on PPP distribution. And so I think fintech is here to stay. Financial institutions are also reacting, especially with COVID and the 2020 year that we saw with the transition to digital. You couldn't sell financial services from a storefront anymore. You had to be in the digital space. And so they've all started to level up their game as well. And when you have APIs like the ones Plaid offers, like the ones some of our competitors offer that are speaking at Tearsheet, you can actually start to reimagine financial services, pull the pieces apart, reconfigure them, and you're going to start to reconfigure them in ways that service niche markets, especially in a way that's especially relevant for their specific use case. And, some of the neobanks I think about that couldn't have existed in a physical world are folks like, First Boulevard or Daylight, which are neobanks that are targeting either, specific segments of the population like African American or specific segments of the population like LGBTQT, because those segments are not geographic, which is the way we've organized financial services for 100 years. We had credit unions and banks with regional presence or super regionals or nationals where you could see them in every state. Now with the internet, you can go and service these people by interest or by segment. And, we see a lot of millennial banking apps or Gen Z banking apps that are helping people get acquainted to using financial services, even if you're just a kid and your parents want to get you your first debit card. It almost seems like a toy, but really that is like on-ramps to the financial ecosystem. And I know that I still have an account at Fidelity from when I had my first like real big kid summer job. And my mom was like, save money, invest it in the Roth IRA. It was like the new thing. Put it in the retirement. You won't touch it. And, that's how I got acquainted with the financial ecosystem. So we still see that happening, but it's going to be a little bit different than how we did it and how our parents did it.
Totally. And we definitely see that from the Tearsheet side. We're seeing these niche challenger banks, as you described, the First Boulevard and the Daylights. Almost every week, there's a new challenger bank launching to service a very specific demographic, as you said, not geographic, but demographic. It's really interesting right now.
Totally.
Yeah. So how do you advise clients and partners along the lines of crafting a strategy around open finance or improving a strategy that they already have in place?
Yeah. So that's the other piece of it that I was kind of getting back to, and thanks for reminding me, which is the financial institutions that actually have a lot of the customers today. A lot of them have been kind of sitting out in this world. And this is especially in the US where, we have a rule a section of the law called Dodd-Frank 1033, but there hasn't been a rule written. So there's nothing the government is saying you have to do. There is a law that says consumers own their data, but like how that gets implemented has really been up to the private sector. And so there have been times when folks like Plaid and the banks have been a little bit at loggerheads on like, how do we do this from a technical perspective? I think we're getting past that, honestly. And our announcement a couple of weeks ago with US Bank is a really good example. US Bank has been an amazing partner, and I always have to give a shout out to our partners at US Bank because they really care about security, customer control, and transparency. And those are like really important principles for Plaid as we think about how to build the ecosystem. Security is really, how do we make sure that credentials are not being stored and credentials are not the primary way people access data? That's moving to APIs. There's a bunch of different solutions out there, but there's one big industry consortium, which is FTX, which is a great convening force. And then Plaid, we also have an API called Plaid Exchange, which is a lightweight option that a lot of the neobanks are building into. And I think over time, a lot of the best pieces of Plaid Exchange will converge into FTX. And that's why we sit on the FTX board to make that standard as good as possible. The other thing, though, is like there's some stuff that's not in the standard yet. And that's technology that we built specifically with US Bank that we help their customers migrate seamlessly over to this new API. And then there's transparency around this concept we call Plaid Portal, which is available at my.plaid.com. And it's a beta product for us, but you can see where you've connected all of your financial apps. And if you're living in this digital world, you probably have used something like a Venmo or a Robinhood or a Chime or an Acorns or a Digit at some point, and you've connected it. And the question is, are you still using it? Do you want to do some maintenance? Do you want to even just have that visibility? With US Bank, customers will be able to go to the US Bank page, see all of those applications, control them, revoke access. They'll also be able to go to the Plaid page and see all their US Bank connections going out. And they'll remain completely in sync. So the portal within the US Bank site and the portal within the Plaid site will always have the same data. And that's something technically that's been really great to see. And we've been able to migrate 100% of the customers over to that new API, which has allowed us to purge millions of credentials from the ecosystem.
That's awesome. And we covered that story, the US Bank story, the Plaid. I guess using US Bank and your description as I guess a baseline, like how I guess I'm trying to ask how many other banks or how far along most banks are compared to a US Bank in terms of adopting that same type of sort of ethos or stance towards open finance.
Yeah. No, so the good news is there's a ton of energy at the top, right? The largest financial institutions. We've publicly announced deals with Chase and Wells Fargo and US Bank. There's a few others that are large top 10 financial institutions that we're working with, but we haven't publicly announced. Mm-hmm. And so I'd say if you're a top 10 or top 20 financial institution, you are working on this actively. You may not have technology that's out there publicly. You may not have done press releases, and that's fine. Like not everybody is going to do a press release, but it is a top of house issue. And it's something that, in the same way that online banking was kind of niche in the year 2000, but by the time you got to 2010, it had become table stakes and you had to have a website. Mobile banking was niche in 2010. The iPhone was new, Android was new, but by 2020, you had to have a mobile app. Outbound data APIs are kind of at that same place where they're a little bit niche today within the bank world, but in 5 or 10 years in the future, it's going to be table stakes. And so the big banks are probably the ones who have been at this the longest and are thinking about how to implement. But then we also have some great partners on the tech provider side. So companies like Jack Henry that light up literally hundreds of, if not thousands of smaller community financial institutions. Those are great people to work with to get leverage within the ecosystem. And they're also pretty progressive from a technology perspective, which is great. They both have kind of that legacy on-prem model, but they also have the SaaS model. And so it's really very easy to work with them, especially if they have like some newer banks that are on the SaaS model. And, beyond that, we have to work with the industry bodies. We have to keep pushing ourselves on what is the future going to look like. Historically, data within these apps, if you think about mint.com, it's been that spinning wheel, right? So everything's been fetched from the financial institution. That's really not the way it should work in 2021. So we have a piece of the Plaid Exchange API that talks about real-time transactions, which is the same as what, Amex and Chase and a bunch of the credit card issuers, I think Capital One as well, send you a push under certain conditions. Like, I spent over $1,000. I want to know that all the time. A lot of fintech apps like Copilot or Truebill have this functionality, but it's historically been based on lagged data. And so Plaid, we were trying to update people's data 3-4 times a day for those use cases. If it was real time, the products and services that could be built would be even better. And it would unlock a whole new category. So that's the type of stuff where we want to work with the industry to be a leader and work with the other companies that are leaders in making their services better for end users.
Totally get it. Very well described. So who wins in this whole sort of push towards open finance?
Yeah, I mean, this is the easiest question you're going to ask me. It's consumers. So softball, let me just, but, when I think about like, should data remain locked up and be proprietary, my data, for somebody else's benefit? The answer is obviously no. And so the question is, how do we get there? I'm kind of moving the conversation from are we there yet to how do we get there? We think that engagement across markets and across different ecosystem participants is the way we're going to do it as fast as possible. The US Bank announcement is a great version of that, but we have a couple of other interesting announcements coming out later this year. And, the goal is to expand financial access for everyone. And everyone means all consumers, all small businesses. I think there's also some interesting stuff happening on the corporate banking side. We're a little bit less involved in that, but I'm always like talking to my friends at like Goldman Sachs and some of these companies that have corporate banking APIs, because even that world, you saw this last year, there's a lot of room for improvement. And, open data, open finance is one of the big things that's going to make consumers and small businesses' lives better when it comes to managing their money and have better suited products at better rates. And so that's the thing I'm most excited about.
That's awesome. And I really like your perspective. I appreciate it that you're bringing to this conversation. So what role does policy play, I guess, in moving towards open finance?
Yeah, so the CFPB, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, asked for a request for a comment, basically, on this 1033 Dodd-Frank rulemaking. We wrote a 55-page response, a comment letter. I think our policy team, I was not the primary author on this, but our policy team does an amazing job. And it's probably like the single best document that lays out Plaid's view on how the ecosystem should evolve. But we really tried to take a fairly neutral stance. So not just benefiting Plaid as a company, but what would be good for the ecosystem, what would be good from a security and transparency perspective, and what would be good for consumers and small businesses. So there's that effort going on in the US. We've also been engaged with Finance Canada. They're writing rules currently and starting to think about how they implement their version of open banking. We respond to regulators in markets where we are a regulated entity, like the UK. We've been in an active dialogue back and forth. And this is all on the public record with the Financial Conduct Authority there, and in the European Union with the relevant banking regulators within each state. I think as we kind of look beyond, we're starting to even, have initial conversations and dialogues with some of the regulators within markets that were not active. So Australia, Mexico, Brazil, all of these places are starting to think. India is a really interesting one, that are trying to implement open banking, open finance, or a consumer data right. And I think the next 3 to 5 years is going to be really fruitful for that. So there's a huge role for policy to play, in addition to, market-led activity.
We're getting to the end of my questions. We also have a couple questions from the audience. I want to ask you how you'd advise industry participants to position themselves. Yeah,
so I think the number one thing is that industry participants need to understand it's a very competitive market out there. But just because you open up the data doesn't mean you're going to lose 100% of your customers or lose 100% of your data. I think thinking about it from like, what am I going to lose perspective means you're probably not going to build the right things, and it's probably going to contribute to you losing. So you need to think about it from an opportunity perspective. This is a feature of financial services, being able to share your data. And it's not a feature that's new. Like one of the reasons you sent statements in the mail historically is so that people had a record of their data. And this is a digital record of their data. And they need to talk to accountants, to other financial advisors, to other financial institutions. To get a lease on a house, usually you have to show your income and your pay stubs, right? So there's a ton of different activity that happens as matter of course beyond the four walls of the financial institution. I think what digital challenges both financial institutions, neobanks, as well as community financial institutions is, how do we make this a really seamless process for consumers? And how do they understand that we're actually powering this and working with them to make their lives better as a partner, as a guardian of the data? And I think those are actually big opportunities.
Awesome. So we have time for a couple questions. Actually,
let's do it.
2 questions came from one person, from Shuman. What are some future use cases for API fueled access to consumer data?
Yeah, so I mean, there was this announcement or an article in the Wall Street Journal about Project Reach from the OCC. And I thought that was really interesting, which is about large financial institutions, as well as participants like Plaid. We're part of the working group with the OCC, thinking about cash flow data for underwriting purposes. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of regulation in the US, primarily something called the Fair Credit Reporting Act, that says how and where you can use data and tries to make sure that nobody who's making loans is contributing to disparate impacts. So any type of like negative underwriting that discriminates against a specific group. But there are ways to use cash flow data that don't discriminate and actually expand access. There's something like 50 million adults in the United States that are either thin file or no file, and a lot of them do have cash flow data. So that's like a huge opportunity, and one that we're really excited about contributing to.
Awesome. Shuman's second question is Plaid engaged in initiatives to inform consumers of the importance of consumer permission data access, and if you feel there's a knowledge gap to be bridged at this point?
I think yes and no. So one, we're always trying to do our best to have consumable content within the narrow experience where people see Plaid. So we were kind of the first ones to say, hey, when you're in the Venmo app, we're going to say, by the way, your data is being shared with Plaid. We're the person in the middle that's going out and fetching this data and retrieving it from your financial institution. So we've tried to lead with transparency and do it in a way that the consumer can understand in like bite-sized chunks. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I think technology is really magic. And the best technology, you don't need to inform the consumer. Like I flip on a light switch at my house. Maybe if I've done a lot of reading, I understand how all the electrical current and the filament bulb or the LED or whatever it is work. But the best technology just becomes the environment around us. And I think if we do our jobs well, as I said, 10 years from now, you won't be thinking about like, oh, it's an API and like, here's how it works. It's just like, this is how I share my data. I know it's secure and I know it happens instantly and the data is updated in real time. And whenever I want to revoke it, I can. That's pretty straightforward, actually. And so that's the world we're trying to get to.
I like that answer. Dan, thanks for joining us on DataDay 2021. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zach. This was a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to attending a few more of the sessions this afternoon.
Glad to have you.